At 71, Walter Hayes should have been enjoying a quiet retirement, but instead he spent nearly everything he had to buy an abandoned sheep farm that everyone in town called a frozen graveyard. His own children thought he'd lost his mind. The auction crowd laughed as he signed the papers, and even his new neighbors warned that no one had survived a first winter there without losing everything. Then, only weeks after he arrived, the worst winter storm in decades buried the valley under walls of snow. The fences disappeared. The sheep began vanishing into the blizzard, and while searching for them, Walter stumbled upon something hidden beneath the old barn, something no one had touched since the farm's darkest winter. But before he could understand what he had found, everything changed.
Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. If you're starting your morning, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. And if you're listening tonight, I hope this story keeps you company. Leave a comment below to join our community. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, forgotten family legacies, and incredible second chances,
Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next adventure. Walter Hayes had spent 43 years keeping freight trains moving across the mountains, arriving before sunrise, leaving long after dark, and believing that as long as something needed fixing, he still had a purpose. Retirement was supposed to be the reward. His co-workers shook his hand, presented him with an engraved watch, shared stories over coffee, and wished him peaceful days ahead. But after the small celebration ended and the parking lot emptied, Walter drove home to a house that had felt far too quiet ever since his wife, Margaret, passed away 3 years earlier. The silence greeted him before he even unlocked the front door. The photographs on the mantel hadn't changed. Margaret still smiled from every frame. The chair beside the fireplace remained exactly where she'd left it, untouched because moving it somehow felt like saying goodbye a second time. At 71, Walter suddenly realized that all the years he had counted toward retirement had never included a plan for what came after. His son lived in Arizona. His daughter was in Oregon. They called when they could, visited when life allowed, but they had families, careers, and responsibilities of their own. Walter never blamed them. He simply found himself eating dinner alone more often than he cared to admit. For 2 restless weeks, he tried everything people suggested. He fished, he read novels, he watched television until the evenings blurred together. None of it filled the emptiness left by a lifetime of meaningful work. Then, one rainy afternoon, while flipping through a local auction catalog at a diner, his attention stopped on a single listing: Dalton Sheep Farm, sold as is. The photograph showed weathered barns, broken fences, and fields swallowed by weeds. Half the roofs needed replacing. The farmhouse leaned slightly to one side. According to the description, the property had been abandoned for nearly 20 years. Most buyers would have turned the page without another glance. Walter kept staring. The land stretched across a quiet valley surrounded by low mountains. Even beneath years of neglect, he could imagine healthy pasture, repaired buildings, and animals grazing beneath open skies. It reminded him of the small farm where his grandfather had raised sheep when Walter was a boy. Those summers had been among the happiest memories of his childhood. Before long, curiosity became determination. The following weekend, Walter drove to see the property. The road wound through pine forests before opening into a broad valley where the farm sat alone against distant hills. Up close, it looked even worse than the pictures. Fence posts leaned at impossible angles. Rust covered old gates. Empty sheep pens stood buried beneath wild grass. The wind whistled through loose boards on the largest barn, making the entire place sound as though it were sighing after years of waiting. Yet Walter didn't see ruin. He saw work, honest work, work that demanded patience instead of speed, work that might finally give meaning to the years he still had left. When auction day arrived, fewer than 20 people gathered inside the county building. Most came out of curiosity rather than serious interest. The Dalton farm had earned a reputation no one wanted. Bidding opened low and barely moved. A rancher offered a token amount before shaking his head. Another investor laughed and said the cleanup alone would cost more than the land. Walter quietly raised his paddle. The room turned toward him. Someone whispered, "He's not serious." Another chuckled. The auctioneer looked over his glasses. "Sir, you understand this property hasn't supported a flock in decades." Walter nodded calmly. "I understand." The auctioneer waited for another bid. None came. The gavel struck once. "Sold!" Laughter spread across the room. Not cruel enough to be called hostile, but certain enough to make its point. An older rancher muttered loudly, "Poor fella's spending retirement digging himself a grave." Another replied, "First Wyoming winter will send him packing." Walter signed the papers without answering either of them. He had spent too many years solving difficult problems to let strangers define what was impossible. Breaking the news to his children proved harder. His daughter stared at him through the video call in disbelief. "Dad, an abandoned sheep farm? You're 71. His son sighed before asking the question Walter expected. "Why not move closer to one of us?" Walter smiled gently. "Because I don't need someone to take care of me. I need something worth taking care of." Neither child argued after that, though neither sounded convinced. They promised to visit when they could. A week later, Walter loaded everything he owned into a small trailer and drove toward his new home. The farmhouse required more repairs than he could count. The roof leaked in 2 places. The water heater barely worked. Dust covered every room. Still, by sunset he had unpacked his clothes, made coffee on the old stove, and stood on the porch overlooking the empty pasture. The valley was beautiful in a lonely sort of way. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine across the fields. Somewhere in the distance, a lone sheep bleated from a neighboring ranch. The next morning, Walter met Ben Holloway, the nearest neighbor, who arrived driving an aging pickup loaded with fence posts. Ben studied Walter for a long moment before speaking. "You're really staying?" "That's the plan," Walter replied. Ben looked toward the worn barns and then the mountains already dusted with early snow. "I've lived in this valley almost my whole life." He hesitated before adding quietly, "If you stayed through your first winter here." Walter waited. Ben met his eyes with an expression that carried more concern than judgment. "Pray it shows you mercy." Walter watched the old truck disappear down the gravel road. Above the mountains, dark clouds gathered earlier than they should have. And by evening, every local weather station interrupted its regular programming with the same warning: the strongest winter storm in decades was moving directly toward the valley. Walter woke before dawn to the sound of wind pressing against the farmhouse windows. The storm warning from the night before echoed in his thoughts. But the sky outside was still clear enough to work. He poured a cup of coffee, pulled on his old work boots, and stepped into the cold morning, determined to accomplish as much as possible before winter arrived in full. The first task was the fencing. Years of neglect had left entire sections collapsed, and while he had only purchased a modest starter flock from a neighboring ranch, He knew sheep needed secure boundaries long before heavy snow covered the valley. His hands remembered years of repairing machinery, and although stretching wire and driving fence posts required different skills, patience served him just as well. Every repaired section gave him quiet satisfaction. By noon, he had finished nearly 100 yards. It wasn't enough, but it was progress. During the afternoon, a delivery truck arrived with several bales of hay Walter had ordered immediately after purchasing the farm. The driver climbed down, looked across the weathered buildings, and shook his head. "You're cutting this close," Walter smiled while helping unload the hay into the largest remaining barn. "I've been told that more than once." "Believe it," the man answered. "This valley doesn't forgive late preparations." Walter stacked every bale carefully, keeping them dry beneath the strongest section of roof. He counted repeatedly, estimating how long the supply might last if the storm trapped him for days. Experience had taught him that careful planning solved many problems before they appeared. Still, he couldn't ignore how much work remained. Several gates needed reinforcing, and one corner of the pasture remained almost completely exposed. As the afternoon shadows stretched across the fields, a dusty pickup turned into the driveway. A woman stepped out wearing insulated boots and carrying a medical case marked with a veterinary symbol. She introduced herself with a friendly smile. "Emily Carter. Ben told me someone new bought the Dalton place. I figured I'd better introduce myself before winter does." Walter welcomed her inside for coffee before showing her the sheep. Emily moved confidently among the animals, checking eyes, hooves, and coats, while asking practical questions about feed, vaccinations, and shelter. Walter answered honestly whenever he knew something, and admitted when he didn't. She appreciated that. "Most people pretend they know everything," she said while examining one ewe. "That's usually when animals suffer." Walter nodded. "Spent my whole career fixing mistakes that started because someone thought asking for help made them look weak." Emily smiled at that. After finishing her inspection, she looked toward the mountains where gray clouds had begun collecting again. "Your flock looks healthy, but this farm worries me." "Because it's old?" Walter asked. "Because Wyoming winters don't care how determined you are." She hesitated before continuing. "People around here still talk about this place whenever storms are mentioned." Walter noticed the careful way she chose her words. Ben hinted at something similar. Emily shrugged gently. "I wasn't living here back then. I only know pieces of the stories." Before Walter could ask another question, a boy's voice called from outside. "Mom, come look." Emily sighed with amused patience. "That'll be Noah." Her 12-year-old son had wandered toward one of the abandoned sheep pens while she worked. Walter and Emily found him kneeling near a pile of tall grass beside a weathered fence post. "Look what I found." He brushed away dirt with his glove and lifted a large brass sheep bell attached to a cracked leather collar. Despite years buried beneath weeds, faint lettering remained visible across the metal. Walter wiped away more dirt until the engraving became readable. Dalton. Noah's eyes widened. "Do you think it belonged to one of the original sheep?" Walter turned the bell over in his hands. It carried deep scratches but remained surprisingly solid. "Could have," he answered quietly. Emily looked at the old collar with thoughtful curiosity. "Someone cared enough to have names engraved. That's not very common." Walter carried the bell back to the porch, hanging it beside the front door as if it belonged there. Something about seeing the family name made the abandoned farm feel a little less empty. After Emily and Noah left, Walter continued exploring buildings he had only glanced through since moving in. The oldest sheep barn stood farther from the house, its doors hanging unevenly from rusted hinges. Inside, Broken feeding troughs lined the walls while decades of dust covered everything. As he inspected the floor, one section caught his attention. Near the back wall, beneath scattered straw and fallen boards, several narrow openings ran along the foundation. They looked almost like ventilation grates, except someone had deliberately sealed them with thick wooden planks nailed firmly into place. Walter knelt beside one opening and brushed away dirt. Cold air seeped through tiny cracks between the boards. Whatever lay beyond was still open underneath. He tested one plank with his hammer. It barely moved. Someone had intended for these vents to remain closed. He stood silently, studying the strange construction. Before he could examine it further, the familiar rumble of a truck approached. Ben stepped out carrying a toolbox. "Thought you might need a few extra nails before the weather turns." Walter thanked him, then pointed toward the sealed vents. "Any idea what these were for?" Ben froze for just a moment before walking closer. He stared at the covered openings without speaking. Finally, he answered quietly, "Best leave those alone." "Why?" Ben looked toward the darkening sky instead of the barn. "Some things were closed for good reasons." "Do you know what's behind them?" The older man tightened his grip on the toolbox. "I know enough." Walter waited, but Ben offered nothing more. After setting the toolbox down, he climbed back into his pickup. "Finish your preparations tonight," he said before driving away. Walter watched the truck disappear as an icy wind swept across the valley. He looked once more at the sealed vents, then toward the mountains. Thick clouds now swallowed every peak, and the evening forecast crackled through the farmhouse radio with urgent updates. The storm had changed direction, gained strength, and would arrive nearly a full day earlier than anyone had predicted. The storm reached the valley before sunrise, with a force Walter had never experienced. The wind howled across the open pasture like a freight train racing through a mountain pass, carrying thick sheets of snow that erased fences, trees, and hills within minutes. Looking through the farmhouse window, he could barely see the nearest gate. By the time he finished pulling on his insulated coat and gloves, the first drift had already climbed halfway up the porch steps. He checked the battery-powered radio one last time before stepping outside. Every station repeated the same warning. Travel was impossible. Emergency crews could not reach isolated properties. Residents were urged to remain indoors. Walter switched the radio off. Staying inside was not an option. The sheep depended on him. The wind hit him like a solid wall the moment he opened the door. Snow stung his face despite the scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. Each step toward the main barn required effort, as fresh drifts formed almost as quickly as he pushed through them. The flock crowded together inside, nervous but still calm. Walter checked the feed, spread additional hay across the floor, and secured every latch twice. He knew frightened animals often panicked before people sensed real danger. As he finished, a loud crack echoed across the valley. He turned just in time to see part of the western fence disappear beneath a falling cottonwood branch that the storm had snapped in half. "No," he muttered. Before he could reach the damaged section, several sheep squeezed through the opening and vanished into the swirling white. Walter hurried after them, fighting snow that already reached above his knees. Visibility dropped to only a few yards. Every direction looked identical. The valley he had admired only days earlier had become a featureless world of wind and ice. He managed to guide two frightened sheep back toward the barn, but more continued wandering through the broken fence. Just then, the distant sound of an engine struggled against the storm. Headlights emerged through the white haze before stopping beside the farmhouse. Emily climbed out wearing heavy winter gear while Noah remained inside the truck. "I brought medical supplies," she shouted over the wind. "Ben said your fence wouldn't hold." Walter waved toward the damaged pasture. "I've already lost part of the flock." Emily looked once before making her decision. "Then let's get them back before they scatter farther." Noah rolled down the truck window. "Mom, I'll stay here." She nodded firmly. "Keep the heater running. Don't leave the truck." Together, Walter and Emily pushed into the storm. They spread apart just enough to watch different directions while staying within sight of one another. Whenever they found a sheep, Walter approached slowly while Emily circled behind, guiding the frightened animal back toward the barn. Progress came painfully slowly. Several times the wind became so fierce they were forced to kneel until the strongest gusts passed. Walter's lungs burned from the freezing air. His gloves grew stiff with ice. Yet every recovered sheep strengthened his determination. During one exhausting trip back toward the barn, Walter noticed something unusual. Instead of running toward the newer shelter where the rest of the flock waited, 3 sheep suddenly turned together and struggled across the snow toward the oldest abandoned barn at the far end of the property. "Emily," he called. "They're going the wrong way." She looked up, equally confused. "Why would they head there?" Walter had no answer. The abandoned building offered almost no protection. Its roof sagged badly, and the doors barely hung on their hinges. Yet the sheep moved with surprising confidence, as though following a path they somehow recognized. They reached the old barn and disappeared behind a snow-covered wall. Walter and Emily followed. Behind the building, the wind seemed strangely weaker. Snow had drifted high against the stone foundation, almost burying the lower walls completely. Walter searched for the missing sheep until he noticed a narrow line of tracks leading directly into the deepest drift. "There," he said quietly. Emily brushed snow away with her boot. "They're not stopping here." Walter dropped to one knee and began digging with his gloved hands. Beneath several inches of packed snow, his fingers struck weathered wood. Emily joined him, clearing more snow until the outline of a heavy wooden door slowly appeared. Thick iron hinges protruded from the frame, badly rusted but still intact. The sheep tracks ended directly in front of it. Walter stared at the hidden entrance. This wasn't on any property map. Emily ran her hand across the frozen surface. Neither was it meant to be seen. The wind screamed above them while snow continued piling against the old barn. Walter pulled hard on the iron handle. At first, nothing happened. He pulled again with both hands until frozen wood groaned loudly. Finally, the door shifted inward just enough for a blast of surprisingly warmer air to escape through the opening. Both of them froze. Air should not have been moving beneath an abandoned barn after decades of neglect. Walter forced the door wider. Beyond it, darkness stretched downward through a narrow stone passage, disappearing beneath the farm. Emily switched on her flashlight. The beam revealed carefully built stone walls descending into the earth, untouched except for a thin layer of dust. Walter looked from the mysterious passage to the sheep tracks disappearing inside, then back at Emily. Neither spoke. Side by side, they stood before the hidden entrance, staring into the underground corridor as the storm raged above them. Walter tightened his grip on the lantern he had grabbed from the barn, while Emily held her flashlight toward the stone passage. The warm air drifting upward surprised them both. It carried the faint scent of dry hay instead of damp earth. "That shouldn't be possible," Emily said quietly. Walter nodded. Not unless someone designed this place to breathe. He glanced toward the storm raging outside. The missing sheep had vanished into the darkness, and leaving them there was no longer an option. Let's go. They descended carefully, each stone step worn smooth by countless feet long before either of them had been born. The passage sloped gently downward before widening into a broad underground chamber. Emily slowly swept the flashlight across the room. Massive timber beams supported the ceiling. Thick stone walls surrounded a space far larger than either had imagined. Wooden feeding racks lined both sides. Old water troughs stretched along the center. Above them, narrow shafts disappeared toward the surface, allowing a steady flow of fresh air to circulate through the shelter. Walter immediately recognized what he was seeing. "Those sealed vents beneath the barn," he whispered. "They weren't random." Emily looked upward as the cold draft drifted through the shafts. "It's a complete ventilation system." Walter stepped farther inside, running his hand across one of the heavy support posts. Despite decades of abandonment, the wood remained remarkably solid. Whoever had built the shelter had understood both engineering and winter survival. Behind them, several frightened sheep emerged from the darkness and quietly gathered near one of the feeding racks, as though they had found a place that felt safe. Walter exchanged a surprised glance with Emily. "Animals remember shelter," she said softly. "Sometimes longer than people remember stories." Walter walked slowly through the underground space, counting the feeding stations. There were far too many for the small flock he had purchased. This place could hold hundreds of sheep. Emily nodded. Maybe more. Dust covered nearly every surface, yet very little appeared damaged. Snow and wind had never reached this hidden room. Even after decades, it remained dry. Walter's years maintaining railroad tunnels allowed him to appreciate the craftsmanship. Every ventilation shaft had been positioned to draw fresh air while keeping snow from blocking the openings. The ceiling was high enough to prevent moisture buildup. Stone channels along the floor directed water away toward hidden drains. Nothing about the shelter looked improvised. Someone had planned every detail. "This wasn't built in a hurry," Walter said. "It must have taken years." Emily traced her flashlight across the walls until the beam rested on faded markings scratched into one corner. They approached together. Several dates had been carved into the wood, nearly erased by time. Beneath them appeared rows of small tally marks, grouped carefully in cents. Walter studied them. "Livestock records?" Emily guessed. "Possibly." Nearby, they found several rusted lantern hooks and the remains of old wooden benches. This had never been simply a storage cellar. People had worked here for extended periods. Walter imagined families sheltering underground while blizzards roared overhead. The thought made the hidden chamber feel strangely alive, despite its silence. At the rear of the shelter, another heavy wooden door stood partially open. Inside lay a smaller room containing shelves built into the stone walls. Most had collapsed under age, leaving scattered fragments across the floor. Walter carefully stepped over broken boards until something caught his eye beneath a layer of dust. Kneeling slowly, he uncovered what remained of a leather-bound notebook. The cover had stiffened with age, and several pages crumbled the moment he touched them. Emily crouched beside him. "Can you open it?" Walter did so with great care. Many pages had been ruined by time. Their ink faded beyond recognition. Others were stuck together permanently. Still, several sections remained readable. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as though written during difficult days. Walter turned page after fragile page until only the final surviving sheet remained attached to the binding. Most of it had been torn away. A jagged edge ran across the center where several pages had clearly been removed long ago. Only one incomplete sentence remained visible near the bottom. "If the storm returns." The words stopped there. Nothing followed. Walter stared at the torn edge. Emily slowly turned the notebook over, hoping another page had become trapped inside. But there was nothing. "Someone removed the ending," she said quietly. Walter looked back toward the vast underground shelter stretching into the shadows. Above them, the muffled roar of the blizzard continued through layers of earth and stone, while around them stood undeniable proof that someone had once prepared this farm for storms unlike ordinary winters. Yet the only written explanation had been deliberately interrupted. He gently closed the damaged journal and held it in both hands, unable to stop wondering what had been written after those 4 unfinished words. Morning arrived without sunrise. Thick clouds still covered the valley, and the storm continued to bury the farm beneath fresh snow. Inside the underground shelter, however, the air remained calm. Walter could hardly believe the difference. While fierce winds shook the old barn overhead, the hidden chamber stayed dry and surprisingly warm. The sheep that had wandered inside no longer appeared frightened. They gathered quietly near the feeding racks, instinctively settling into a place that somehow felt familiar, even after decades of abandonment. Walter carefully wrapped the damaged journal in a clean cloth from his coat pocket before placing it inside his backpack. "We shouldn't leave this here," he said. Emily nodded. "If it survived this long, it deserves better than another winter underground." Before returning to the surface, they continued exploring every corner of the shelter. Near the rear wall, they discovered several wooden storage bins built into the stone. Most were empty, except for scattered straw and dust, but one still contained a handful of brittle papers protected beneath a rusted metal lid. Walter lifted them carefully. Time had yellowed every page, yet several remained readable. They were purchase receipts. "Feed supplier," Walter murmured while reading the faded print. Another sheet listed deliveries of hay, then another. Emily accepted several pages and began arranging them by date. Her expression slowly changed. "Walter, look at these quantities." He compared the figures. "That's impossible." According to the receipts, Frank Dalton had purchased enough winter feed to support several neighboring ranches, not a single family farm. Walter looked around the underground shelter once more. Suddenly, its enormous size made far more sense. No ordinary flock would ever need this much. Emily frowned thoughtfully. Either these records are wrong, or he was feeding far more animals than anyone realized. Walter slipped the papers beside the journal. Another question had appeared, but no answer accompanied it. They climbed back to the surface carrying as much information as they could protect from the weather. Snow still fell steadily, though the wind had eased enough for them to move livestock safely. Working together, Walter and Emily guided the remaining sheep through the hidden doorway and into the underground shelter. The animals entered willingly, settling along the feeding racks with surprising calm. Emily watched them for several minutes. "I've never seen sheep accept a new shelter this quickly." Walter smiled faintly. Maybe it isn't new to their instincts. Together they carried several bales of hay down the stone passage along with buckets of fresh water. The shelter functioned almost exactly as its unknown builder had intended. The ventilation kept the air fresh, while the thick earth overhead blocked the worst of the cold. Every practical detail reflected careful planning. Hours passed before they finally returned to the farmhouse to warm themselves. Noah had remained safely inside the truck until Ben arrived and escorted him home before the roads became completely blocked. Emily managed to contact her parents by radio to let them know she would remain at the Dalton farm until conditions improved. As evening settled across the buried valley, Walter spread the recovered papers across the farmhouse kitchen table. A lantern cast soft light over every fragile page. Emily brewed coffee while Walter organized the receipts into chronological order. The earliest purchases seemed ordinary. Then, over several consecutive winters, the amounts increased dramatically. Entire wagon loads of hay, additional grain, veterinary medicines, salt blocks, feed supplements. Every receipt carried Frank Dalton's signature. Walter leaned back in his chair. He wasn't preparing for one bad season. Emily looked over another receipt. He was preparing for something much worse. Walter carefully opened the damaged journal again. Many pages remained unreadable, but several surviving entries now made more sense alongside the receipts. One passage described checking ventilation shafts before snowfall. Another listed repairs to drainage channels beneath the shelter. A later entry mentioned expanding storage space before the next winter arrived. None of the entries complained about the work. Instead, they read like quiet reminders written by someone determined to finish an important responsibility. Emily smiled softly. He planned everything. Walter nodded. He expected another terrible storm someday. The words lingered between them. Outside, snow tapped steadily against the windows while the old farmhouse settled under growing drifts. Walter turned another delicate page and discovered a rough inventory written in fading pencil. Most items had become impossible to read, but one line remained clear enough. Extra feed stored beyond valley estimate. Emily frowned. Beyond valley estimate? Walter looked at the receipts again. Maybe he wasn't calculating only his own needs. Neither spoke for several moments. The numbers refused to fit the story everyone seemed to believe about the abandoned farm. If Frank Dalton had truly failed through poor planning, why had he spent years building one of the most carefully designed livestock shelters Walter had ever seen? Why had he purchased enough feed for far more animals than he owned? The evidence pointed in another direction, but not yet toward a complete answer. As Walter gathered the papers into careful stacks, one folded sheet slipped from inside the journal and drifted onto the table. It was not another receipt. It was a hand-drawn map of the valley. Walter unfolded it slowly. Small pencil marks identified nearly every neighboring ranch that had existed decades earlier. Thin lines connected them across the valley like a network, while beside each property appeared simple symbols, circles, squares, and short handwritten notes too faded to read clearly. Emily leaned closer, studying the mysterious markings. Walter traced one weathered finger along the routes stretching from the Dalton farm to every surrounding homestead. Whatever Frank Dalton had planned, it had never involved only his own land. The map suggested that every nearby farm had somehow been part of a much larger design, and neither of them yet understood why. The storm finally began to weaken late the following morning. Snow still drifted across the valley, but the violent winds had faded into long, steady gusts. Walter climbed out of the underground shelter and looked across the farm. The landscape had completely changed. Fences had disappeared beneath deep drifts. The road leading toward town was invisible. Only the tops of old fence posts and the roofs of the barns broke the endless blanket of white. Even so, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. The hidden shelter had done exactly what its unknown builder intended. Every sheep remained safe. After checking the flock and replenishing fresh hay, Walter noticed a pickup slowly making its way through the snow-covered lane. It was Ben. The old truck stopped several yards short of the farmhouse where the snow had become too deep. Ben climbed out carrying a shovel over one shoulder. "Thought I'd better make sure you were still alive," he called with a tired smile. Walter walked over to greet him. "Thanks to that shelter beneath the barn, we are." Ben's expression changed almost instantly. "You found it?" Walter nodded. "The sheep led us there." For several seconds, Ben said nothing. He simply stared toward the old barn, as though looking at a memory instead of a building. Walter spoke carefully. "You knew it existed." Ben lowered his eyes. "I knew enough to hope nobody ever needed it again." They cleared a narrow path together before moving inside the farmhouse, where Emily poured fresh coffee. Ben accepted the warm mug without speaking. His weathered hands rested quietly around it while the room remained still, except for the crackling stove. Finally, Walter placed the faded map, the damaged journal, and the stack of feed receipts onto the kitchen table. "We found these underground." Ben studied them silently. When he saw Frank Dalton's handwriting, he closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I haven't seen that writing in over 40 years. Emily leaned forward. "Ben, what really happened here?" He took a slow breath before answering. "People around here call it the Black Winter. That's what everyone remembers. They remember the snow, the dead livestock, and the ruined ranches. They remember neighbors digging tunnels through drifts just to reach each other's doors." His voice softened. "What they don't remember very well is how close the valley came to losing far more than cattle." Walter listened without interrupting. Ben continued. "The snow kept falling for days. Some drifts climbed higher than the roofs. Roads disappeared. Telephone lines snapped. Nobody could reach town. Feed ran out faster than anyone expected. Families started wondering whether they'd have enough food for themselves, let alone their animals." Emily looked toward the window where snow still covered nearly everything. "My parents mentioned a terrible winter once, but never with this much detail." Ben nodded. "Most folks don't like talking about it." Walter glanced toward the underground shelter hidden beneath the barn. "But some people survived." Ben smiled faintly. "More than should have." He pointed toward the map spread across the table. "Every ranch on that map was occupied back then." Walter traced the pencil lines connecting one property to another. "Frank drew routes between them." "Yes," Ben answered, "though I never understood all of it." Walter leaned forward. "Did Frank build the shelter before that winter?" "Years before." Ben's eyes settled on the damaged journal. "Everyone thought he was wasting money. Said he worried too much. Said no storm would ever justify digging half a mountain beneath a sheep barn." A sad smile crossed his face. "Funny how quickly opinions change when the snow starts falling." Walter remembered the engineering inside the underground chamber and understood the amount of work it must have required. He wasn't preparing for one season. "No," Ben replied quietly. "Frank always believed another great storm would come someday." Emily opened one of the feed receipts. "Then why did he buy so much hay? These amounts don't match the size of his flock." Ben looked at the faded paper but slowly shook his head. "I never knew. Folks noticed the deliveries, but nobody asked many questions. Frank wasn't the kind of man who explained himself." Walter tapped the receipt gently. "These purchases could have fed several ranches." Ben remained silent. His expression suggested he was beginning to understand something for the first time himself. The room fell quiet again until Walter carefully unfolded the valley map. "If he connected every ranch," Ben interrupted softly, "then maybe he expected everyone to need each other." The thought lingered between them. Emily reached for another page from the journal. Most of the writing had disappeared, but one surviving paragraph described inspecting storage bins before heavy snowfall. Another mentioned checking supplies twice instead of once. Every surviving note reflected preparation rather than panic. Walter looked toward Ben. "Did Frank ever speak about helping neighbors?" Ben stared into his coffee. Frank spoke very little about himself. After another long pause, he added, "But I remember one thing." Walter waited. A few days after the storm ended, people started saying they didn't know how some families had lasted so long without feed. Ben frowned as though replaying old conversations in his mind. Nobody could explain it. Walter looked at the receipts again. Suddenly, the impossible quantities seemed less impossible. They remained only a theory, but the evidence was beginning to point in one direction. Emily quietly organized the papers once more. As she lifted the final receipt, something slipped from beneath it onto the table. It was a folded envelope, flattened by years inside the journal. Walter carefully unfolded it. The paper had yellowed badly, but unlike most of the journal, the writing remained readable. Across the top appeared a simple date from more than 4 decades earlier. Beneath it was a single sentence written in steady handwriting. "Please accept these supplies without payment. Your family will need them before spring." No signature appeared at the bottom, only the familiar handwriting they had already recognized as Frank Dalton's. The three of them stared silently at the letter, understanding at last that the feed purchases had never been intended for one farm alone. Walter read the short letter several more times before carefully folding it along its original creases. No signature appeared beneath the message, yet there was little doubt who had written it. The handwriting matched every surviving page of the journal. Emily rested both hands on the kitchen table. "He wasn't selling feed." Walter slowly nodded. "He was giving it away." Ben stared quietly at the lantern flame. Back then, people were too proud to accept charity. If Frank wanted to help, writing "without payment" would have mattered. Silence settled over the room again. Outside, the storm had eased, but the valley remained buried beneath snow that reached nearly to the farmhouse windows. Walter looked once more at the stack of receipts. Buying this much feed must have cost a fortune. Ben answered before anyone else could. It did. Walter turned toward him. "You know that for certain?" Ben sighed deeply. "Because I remember when the bank manager kept driving out here. Folks assumed Frank had made one bad investment after another. Nobody imagined he was borrowing money on purpose." Emily frowned. "How much debt?" Ben shook his head slowly. "Enough that people stopped believing he'd ever recover." Walter felt the weight of those words settle heavily inside him. Throughout his career, he had watched people judge outcomes without ever knowing the work behind them. A broken machine drew criticism until someone discovered the impossible conditions it had endured. Perhaps people had done exactly the same thing to Frank Dalton. Walter spread the receipts across the table in chronological order once more. The pattern became unmistakable. Every large purchase had been followed by another loan. Every loan had been followed by more feed deliveries. Nothing suggested waste. Everything suggested intention. Emily quietly examined one faded invoice after another. "He wasn't spending recklessly," she said. "He kept increasing supplies because he expected more people to need them." Walter pointed toward the valley map. "The routes connect nearly every ranch." Ben leaned closer. "Frank knew every family living here." His voice softened. "If someone was struggling, he usually knew before anyone else." Walter remembered the enormous underground shelter beneath the barn. It suddenly seemed less like a private livestock building and more like part of a much larger plan. He prepared for the entire valley. Ben slowly nodded. Maybe he did. Emily looked thoughtfully at the old man. Then why didn't anyone know? Ben took a long breath before answering. Because after the storm ended, all anyone saw was what Frank had lost. His eyes drifted toward the frosted window. His own flock was nearly gone. The farm was drowning in debt. Within months, the bank began taking everything. Walter listened carefully. Did Frank ever defend himself? Never. Ben's answer came immediately. Not once. That troubled Walter more than anything else. Most people would have explained themselves. They would have pointed toward the families they had helped or the sacrifices they had made. Yet every surviving page of the journal suggested Frank had simply continued working without asking for recognition. Emily smiled sadly. Some people don't know how to talk about kindness. They just keep doing it. Walter thought of Margaret. She had always believed the same thing. Help someone because they need it, not because they might thank you. The memory warmed him for a moment before another gust of wind rattled the windows. The radio on the kitchen counter suddenly crackled to life with an emergency weather update. Walter turned up the volume. The announcer reported that although the first wave of the storm had weakened, a second Arctic front had unexpectedly changed course overnight. Stronger winds and heavier snowfall were now expected to strike the valley before morning. Emily exchanged a worried glance with Walter. Another one? The broadcaster continued listing warnings. Existing snowdrifts would become unstable. Travel remained impossible. Residents were urged to secure livestock immediately before conditions deteriorated again. Walter switched off the radio. Neither he nor Emily spoke for several seconds. Finally, Walter stood. The underground shelter held through the first storm. Emily finished the thought. But we don't know how it'll handle another. Ben rose from his chair with surprising determination. Then we don't wait for daylight. Walter looked at the older man. You've already done enough. Ben smiled faintly. 40 years ago, Frank prepared this place because he believed neighbors should help neighbors. Seems wrong to ignore that lesson now. The three of them bundled into heavy winter clothing and made their way toward the old barn carrying lanterns, ropes, and extra hay. Snow continued falling, though not yet with the violence promised by the forecast. Inside the underground shelter, the sheep remained calm. Walter inspected every support beam, every ventilation shaft, and every drainage channel he could reach. The craftsmanship impressed him even more than before. Nothing had shifted despite the tremendous weight of snow above them. Emily checked each animal carefully, while Ben examined the entrance. Door still seals tight, he reported. Walter nodded. We'll reinforce it anyway. Working together, they stacked additional feed, secured loose equipment, and cleared snow away from the hidden entrance before it could freeze solid. Hours passed unnoticed. None of them complained. Each task completed made the shelter feel more prepared. As Walter finished fastening a heavy timber brace across one interior support, he looked around the chamber with quiet respect. Frank built this to save lives, he said softly. Ben rested one hand against the old stone wall. And tonight, we're trusting him to do it again. Just as the words left his mouth, a deep roar echoed across the valley above them. It was louder than thunder, longer than ordinary wind. Fine dust drifted from the ceiling beams while the lantern flames trembled. Emily looked toward the entrance. That's not the storm. Walter listened carefully. Another heavy rumble rolled across the frozen hillside outside, somewhere beyond the old barn. The second blizzard had arrived with a force powerful enough to shake the mountain itself. The roar above the shelter grew louder until even the stone walls seemed to vibrate beneath it. Walter held his lantern high while tiny streams of dust drifted from the heavy timber beams overhead. Emily instinctively stepped closer to the sheep. The flock remained restless but did not panic, a reassuring sign that the underground chambers still felt secure. Ben listened quietly before nodding toward the ceiling. The mountain's taking the full force now. Walter looked at the ventilation shafts. Cold air still flowed steadily through them, proving they remained open despite the mounting snow above. Frank knew this would happen, he said. That's why every shaft was built with an angle. Snow can't pack directly into them. Emily smiled despite the tension. You're starting to think like the man who built this place. Walter answered with a tired grin. I'm just trying to learn from him before this storm teaches us the hard way. They spent the next hour checking every corner of the shelter again. Walter tightened loose braces with spare bolts he had salvaged from the old barn. Ben shoveled fresh snow away from the entrance whenever drifting threatened to block it. Emily examined each sheep, making certain none showed signs of injury or stress. The hidden chamber continued performing exactly as it had decades earlier. Fresh air circulated through the stone passages. Meltwater disappeared into narrow drainage channels. The temperature remained surprisingly stable. Walter found himself admiring not only the craftsmanship, but also the quiet generosity behind it. Whoever designed this place had never intended it for comfort alone. It had been built to preserve life during the worst days imaginable. Near midday, voices echoed faintly from above. Walter looked toward the entrance in surprise. Did you hear that? Ben listened carefully before climbing the stone steps. He pushed the heavy door open just enough to peer outside. Several bundled figures struggled through the blowing snow toward the old barn. Ben waved them over. Within minutes, 2 neighboring ranchers entered the shelter, exhausted and covered in ice. Walter recognized one of them from the auction, the same man who had laughed when he bought the farm. The rancher removed his hat, embarrassed. Our south barn roof gave out. We managed to move most of the animals, but we didn't know where else to go. Walter simply nodded. Bring whoever needs shelter. The man hesitated. After the way folks treated you, Walter interrupted gently. This isn't the time to worry about that. The rancher's shoulders relaxed with visible relief. Soon, more neighbors arrived, leading small groups of sheep and a few frightened goats through the hidden entrance. Word had somehow spread across the valley that the Dalton farm still offered protection from the storm. Emily organized the animals while Walter and Ben guided each group into unused sections of the shelter. Despite the growing numbers, the underground chamber never felt overcrowded. Its generous design easily accommodated every newcomer. Watching neighbors work side by side without argument reminded Walter of something Margaret often used to say. Difficult times revealed people's true character faster than easy ones ever could. The same rancher who had mocked him now silently carried hay beside him for nearly an hour. Neither man mentioned the past. They simply worked. As evening approached, Walter unfolded Frank's old valley map beside one of the lanterns. He compared the marked routes with the faces now gathered inside the shelter. Many belonged to families whose names appeared on the faded paper. He realized they were standing exactly where Frank must have hoped they would stand if another great storm ever returned. Emily noticed the same thing. His plan worked, she whispered. Walter nodded slowly. Even after all these years. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the chamber. It was different from the wind. Everyone froze. Another crack followed, deeper this time. Walter immediately lifted his lantern and hurried toward the rear section of the shelter. Ben followed close behind. Near the far wall, several small stones had fallen onto the floor. Fine dust drifted steadily from a support arch where a long fracture now stretched across part of the ceiling. Walter studied it carefully. The main beams still held, but one section of the surrounding stone had begun shifting under the tremendous weight of snow above. Emily arrived moments later. "Can it hold?" Walter answered honestly. "I don't know." Another dull groan rolled through the chamber. The fracture widened just enough for everyone to see it. Ben looked toward the frightened families and animals gathered behind them. "If that section gives way—" He never finished the sentence. Walter tightened his grip on the lantern as another shower of dust fell from the cracked ceiling. Knowing the shelter that had protected them through 2 devastating storms was now facing its greatest test. Walter raised the lantern toward the cracked section of the ceiling, studying the fracture the way he had once examined damaged steel beneath railroad bridges. The break looked frightening, but fear alone never solved structural problems. He stepped closer, watching carefully as another faint shower of dust drifted downward. The heavy timber supports remained straight. The stone arch had shifted, yet it had not collapsed. "Nobody panic," he said firmly, turning toward the families gathered farther back. "Move everyone to the opposite side of the shelter. Slowly." His calm voice steadied the room. Emily immediately began guiding the children and livestock away from the damaged section. Ben and the neighboring ranchers formed a line, leading sheep toward the safer feeding racks. Within minutes, the vulnerable corner stood empty, except for Walter and Ben. Walter ran his gloved hand along the nearest support beam. "The wood is still carrying the load," he said. "The stone facing has cracked, but the frame underneath hasn't failed." Ben looked at him hopefully. "Can we reinforce it?" Walter nodded once. "Long enough to ride out the storm." Together they gathered spare timbers stored along one wall. Several of the ranchers joined them without hesitation. Working carefully, Walter directed each man where to position the heavy beams beneath the weakened arch. His decades maintaining aging railroad structures had taught him one lesson above all others. When something couldn't be rebuilt immediately, it could often be supported until danger passed. The work took nearly an hour. Every few minutes, the shelter groaned softly beneath the weight of drifting snow, but the crack widened no further. At last, Walter stepped back and watched the temporary braces settle firmly into place. "That should hold," he said quietly. No one cheered. Everyone simply returned to caring for the animals, understanding how narrowly they had avoided disaster. Hours later, the deep roar of the wind gradually faded. By dawn, the strange silence felt almost unbelievable. Walter climbed the stone steps and forced open the heavy entrance door. Bright sunlight reflected from untouched snow across the valley. The storm had finally passed. Fresh air poured into the shelter as neighbors slowly emerged, one by one, blinking against the brilliant light. Everywhere Walter looked, buildings had suffered damage. Barn roofs had collapsed. Fences had vanished beneath towering drifts. Trees lay broken across fields. Yet when he counted the livestock inside the underground shelter, every sheep, every goat, and every animal entrusted to its protection had survived. Emily smiled with visible relief as she completed her final inspection. "Not one lost." Walter looked around the shelter with quiet gratitude. Frank built this to do exactly what it just did. News spread quickly through the valley once roads began reopening. One neighbor told another how the forgotten shelter beneath the Dalton farm had protected animals from every surrounding ranch. Before long, people who had not spoken about Frank Dalton in decades began visiting the property. They gathered inside the farmhouse one evening after the roads became passable, warming themselves beside the old stove while Walter carefully laid the journal, receipts, map, and letter across the kitchen table. The room fell silent as each person examined the faded documents. An elderly woman adjusted her glasses before touching the copied receipt with trembling fingers. "My father mentioned receiving hay during the Black Winter," she whispered. "He never knew who arranged it." Another rancher stared at the handwritten letter. "My grandfather always said someone left feed outside their barn one night after the roads disappeared." Ben looked around the room. Maybe that someone was Frank. No one argued. Instead, more memories slowly surfaced. One man remembered his parents speaking about an unexpected wagon arriving before the worst snowfall. Another recalled hearing that Frank had traveled through dangerous conditions, checking isolated ranches. None of the stories had seemed important alone. Together, they formed a picture that had remained hidden for more than 40 years. Walter listened quietly as the valley finally began remembering the man behind the abandoned farm. No one spoke about heroism. They spoke about kindness, reliability, and quiet sacrifice. The image of Frank Dalton that had survived for decades, a failed rancher who lost everything, began giving way to something far more truthful. Emily glanced toward Walter. "You helped them see what was always here." Walter shook his head gently. "Frank left the evidence. We only found it." As the gathering came to an end, one of the oldest residents approached Walter carrying a small wooden box worn smooth with age. "This belongs here," the man said softly. "It was delivered to my father after Frank disappeared. He always believed someone from this farm should have it one day." Walter accepted the box with both hands. It was surprisingly light. A simple brass clasp held the lid shut, its surface darkened by time, but still intact. There was no name carved into the wood, no explanation, only years of careful preservation. Walter looked up at the old man, but he simply smiled and nodded. "Your turn now," he said. Walter rested the unopened box on the kitchen table beside Frank Dalton's journal, realizing that after uncovering so much of the forgotten truth, one final piece of the story had quietly been waiting all along. Walter rested both hands on the small wooden box for several long moments before opening it. Around the kitchen table, Ben, Emily, Noah, and several neighbors watched in complete silence. The brass clasp released with a soft click. Inside lay a neatly folded envelope protected beneath a piece of faded cloth. Time had yellowed the paper, but the writing remained remarkably clear. Walter carefully unfolded the letter. At the top was a simple greeting. "To whoever calls this farm home after me." He took a slow breath and began reading aloud. "If you are holding this letter, then this place has outlived me. I hope that means the valley has survived another hard winter. If so, remember that this farm was never meant to belong only to one family. Sheep need shelter. Neighbors do too, if another storm ever comes. Open every gate, unlock every door, and never ask who can afford your help. Winter never chooses its victims, so kindness should never choose either." The room remained perfectly still. Walter continued, "People may remember me as a man who lost everything. That's all right. A good name matters less than knowing children slept warm and families kept their animals alive. If someone finds this someday, don't spend your time defending my past. Spend it protecting someone else's future." Walter lowered the letter. No one spoke for several seconds. Emily quietly wiped away a tear. Ben stared at the floor, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "That's him," he whispered. "That's exactly who Frank was." Walter folded the letter with the same care he had used for the journal. He never wanted recognition. Ben shook his head. He only wanted the valley to survive. News of the letter spread quickly through the community. Within a week, neighbors gathered again, this time inside the old machine shed because it was the only building large enough to hold everyone. Walter displayed the journal, the receipts, the valley map, and Frank's final letter together for the first time. As people moved quietly from table to table, conversations slowly changed. The old stories about a failed rancher disappeared beneath the weight of real evidence. Parents explained the documents to their children. Elderly residents added forgotten memories that finally made sense. Several admitted they had accepted anonymous help during the Black Winter without ever discovering where it came from. One by one, they realized that many of those quiet acts had begun at the Dalton farm. Before the meeting ended, the town council president stood and addressed the crowd. "We've spent 40 years remembering the wrong story." Heads nodded throughout the room. "It's time we corrected it." No one objected. Early the following month, after roads had fully reopened and the snow began slowly melting, the community gathered once more beside the old barn. A simple stone monument had been placed near the entrance to the underground shelter. It carried only a few words. "Frank Dalton. He prepared so others could endure." Walter stood quietly among the crowd as Ben stepped forward and rang the old brass sheep bell Noah had discovered beneath the weeds. Its clear tone echoed gently across the valley. For a moment, no one said anything. They simply listened as the sound drifted over the fields Frank had once protected. Spring arrived gradually. Snow retreated from the hillsides. Grass pushed through the frozen ground. The repaired fences surrounding the farm stretched farther every week. Volunteers from neighboring ranches appeared almost daily, offering lumber, equipment, or simply another pair of hands. Nobody kept track of who helped whom anymore. They simply worked together, much as Frank's map had quietly suggested decades before. Walter decided the underground shelter would never again be hidden behind sealed doors. With help from the community, they repaired damaged stonework, strengthened the ceiling where the recent storm had caused cracks, and restored the ventilation system without changing the original design. The shelter would remain ready whenever another hard winter came. Emily became a regular visitor, checking livestock and helping organize emergency supplies. Noah eagerly learned everything Walter could teach him about caring for sheep, repairing fences, and maintaining the old buildings. More than once, Walter caught himself smiling as the boy raced across the pasture with the same excitement he himself had felt on his grandfather's farm many years earlier. The quiet loneliness that had followed Margaret's passing no longer filled the farmhouse. Laughter returned to the kitchen. Shared meals became common. Friends arrived without needing invitations. Walter realized he had not simply purchased abandoned land. He had found a community waiting to remember who it truly was. Months later, during a town gathering before the next winter season, Walter made one final announcement. "This farm will always remain a working sheep farm," he said. "But from now on, it will also serve as an emergency refuge for ranchers, livestock, and anyone who needs help during severe storms. The shelter beneath the barn belongs to every family in this valley." The applause that followed carried none of the laughter he had heard at the auction months earlier. This time it carried gratitude. As autumn gave way to another cold season, Supplies once again filled the underground storage rooms. Fresh hay lined the feeding racks. Medical kits sat neatly organized beside clean water barrels. Every preparation echoed Frank Dalton's quiet example. Not because anyone expected praise, but because they understood why the work mattered. One crisp morning, Walter stood alone on the porch watching hundreds of healthy sheep graze across fields that had once seemed beyond saving. The repaired barns glowed softly beneath the rising sun in the distance. Emily and Noah walked the fence line while Ben waved from his pickup before continuing toward his own ranch. Walter reached beside the front door and gently lifted the old brass bell bearing the Dalton name. He rang it once. Its familiar note rolled across the valley just as it had on the day the monument was dedicated. He smiled. Not because retirement had given him the peaceful life everyone expected, but because it had given him something far more valuable. At 71, when most people believed his best years were already behind him, he had discovered that purpose could still be found in unexpected places, that forgotten kindness could outlive the harshest winter, and that the greatest inheritance was never a piece of land, but the chance to continue someone else's compassion. As the bell's final echo faded into the clear morning air, and the flock moved peacefully across the green pasture, Walter looked over the farm that no longer felt abandoned and quietly whispered, "We'll be ready."